Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 Virtual Gaithersburg Book Festival, or as we like to call it, the VGBF. I'm Phil Kaminsky, your VGBF host, and I'll be helping you navigate all the virtual programming coming your way over the next month, right here on the GBF YouTube channel. Although we miss hosting you in person, we're extremely excited to have you virtually at tonight's presentation featuring Tom and Lorenzo. Before we jump to tonight's main event, though, it would be great if you could do three things for us. First, please like this video. Second, leave a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. And third, please hit the subscribe bell so that we can receive notifications about all upcoming and the latest presentations for you. As you have questions during this presentation, please post them in the chat. Most of them will be relayed to the authors and will be answered at the end of the presentation. Additionally, we encourage you to support tonight's authors by purchasing their book through independent bookseller and our festival partner, Politics and Prose. And as always, a huge thank you goes out to our featured sponsors, the David and Mikel Blair Family Foundation, Downtown Crown RPAI, and Montgomery College. Okay, let's get started. Tonight, we have with us the highly entertaining pop culture blogging duo, Tom and Lorenzo, here to take us on a deep dive into queer history and culture with their book, Legendary Children, the first decade of RuPaul's Drag Race and the last century of queer life. Tom Fitzgerald and Lorenzo Marquez are also hosts of the Pop Style Opinion Fest podcast. For well over a decade now, the New York Times, Cosmopolitan, Town and Country, NPR, and countless other media outlets have turned to TILO for witty, entertaining, thought-provoking observations on fashion, celebrity, television, film, pop culture, and the LGBTQ life. Tom and Lorenzo, welcome.
Thank you, Phil. So great to be here.
Yes.
Just want to say a quick thank you to the entire festival for pulling this together. We're so thrilled to be here. I want to thank the city of Gaithersburg. I want to thank Mayor Judd Ashman for being so welcoming. And a special shout out to Becky and Rachel. We wouldn't be here without them.
Yes.
So with that, I think we're just going to get started. As Phil said, we're the authors of the book, Legendary Children, the first decade of RuPaul's Drag Race and the last century of queer life. This book has been our baby. It has been a gift. It has been a journey. And I just said to Lorenzo before we went live, I said, I don't know if we're going to be doing any more tour dates after this. So I'm thrilled that we're getting one final chance to reach out to our fans, to read the book to them, and to talk to them about the book. So let's talk about the book. First thing we want to get across is, if you haven't read the book or if you don't know much about it, it is not a fan guide to RuPaul's Drag Race. And you don't necessarily have to be a fan of RuPaul's Drag Race to read the book. The sort of genesis of the book was, we have been bloggers. We're a married couple. We have been blogging for 15 years. And we started blogging RuPaul's Drag Race, recapping the show from the very first episode from the very first year, February of 2009. And we have been recapping and blogging that show constantly, unceasingly ever since. I wouldn't say we're experts. I think there are a lot of Drag Race experts out there that can quote the show chapter and verse. But we've been with it from the beginning, and we have an understanding of queer culture and pop culture generally, because we've been writing about it for 15 years. So our agent actually came to us and said, you guys have been writing about this for so long, you should do a book about Drag Race. And we loved the idea. It seemed like a no-brainer. And we wrote a proposal that originally did seem like a bit more of a fan guide, like top 10 most sickening looks and that sort of thing. However, we like I said, we've been pop culture writers for a long time. We couldn't write about the show and not put in all of this stuff that we knew about the references that the show was pulling from, about the things that the show pays homage to in queer culture.
Right.
So over time, the proposal, with some help from our agent and help from our editor at Penguin, the proposal changed into, rather than being a book about Drag Race, let's write a book using Drag Race as a template to talk about the history of queer culture, of queer life in the last 100 years.
Right, and it was a great suggestion from our editor, especially because we noticed we tend to watch the show and at the same time follow social media, follow Twitter, and see what the viewers are talking about. And we noticed that with every season, we noticed that RuPaul and the judges and even the drag queens would drop a reference, would drop any line of any movie or any gay reference. And we noticed that some of the viewers, the young ones especially, they didn't know where that reference came from. And we're like, wow, this is from the movie, a movie, or I don't know, somebody said that in the past.
Paris is Burning,
right,
or The Queen, and various other things that
other places, because you can tell that the show RuPaul's Drag Race, they pull directly from the LGBTQ community, all the references, all the jokes, everything.
RuPaul is a pop culture sponge,
right,
always has been, and a pop culture aficionado. But she's also someone who has a deep understanding of queer history,
right,
and of drag history. And that informs the show in a million different ways. Just real quick example, every time, for years, whenever Ru would introduce the library challenge
right,
in the workroom, she would say, "In the grand tradition of Paris is Burning."
And that's from the movie.
Yeah. Paris is Burning basically defined what shade and reading was for
right,
the mainstream public. Whenever Ru would introduce the Snatch Game challenge, she would say, "In the grand tradition of drag." And that was a reference to the fact that drag has a long history of celebrity female impersonation. There's a million other different things. There's so many other different things. When we first started writing about the show, and for years afterwards, we said, this is the truest representation of queer social culture we'd ever seen on television, where it was just queer people hanging out around, talking like queer people and making the jokes that queer people make and making the references that queer people make. So it was very easy for us in the writing of this book to make that leap from talking about RuPaul's Drag Race to talking about queer culture generally, and to giving the reader an understanding of the sort of arc of queer culture and of queer life in the last 100 years. And we specifically chose to limit it to a century,
right?
Because basically the Drag Race isn't pulling references that go back any further than that. And we chose to basically restrict it to the United States.
Right, because when we were doing our research, of course, you keep expanding and expanding. And it's not that we forgot all the international icons out there representing our culture. No, there's a ton of them. But we just wanted to make sure that the book had some sort of limit. At least this one. Maybe we'll write another one about the international icons. But this one is specifically, we wanted to emphasize the legendary children or the icons in the United States.
If you don't know, legendary children is a term used in the drag ball community to talk about people. I mean, I think the phrase is very self-explanatory, to talk about people who are up and coming, who are going to make legends out of themselves. And it's a phrase that Ru has used many times in the show. We didn't make that phrase up. Everything in the book is an homage or a reference to something in our cultural history, in our queer cultural history. And when we started writing it, we wanted to, it was very, like, from the first chapter, from the first outline of the first chapter, we turned to each other and said, we don't want this to be a book about drag queens. We don't want this to be a book just about men in dresses. We wanted it to be about the whole of queer existence over the last 100 years. So there are, and the book highlights not just historical events and historical references, but people. It'll spotlight and give short biographies of people. And those biographies are the heart and soul of the book. And they are as expansive as we could make them. Which means that we have stories of drag queens and drag kings and trans women and trans men and gay men and lesbians and bi people and non-gender conforming people in our, or, non-binary people in our history. That was very, very important to us because our understanding of Drag Race and its fandom is that there is a very young, broadly sort of queer fandom that has hooked onto the show. If any of you have ever seen pictures of or gone to DragCon, which is held once a year in New York and Los Angeles, it is basically the Drag Race convention. We went to the New York one last year, and we looked out on the floor of the convention center, and I said, look, this is who we're writing this book for. Because it was all these like under 20 under 20 years old kids who were sort of expressing this very broad form of queerness and glitter and unicorns and pink. And we're looking at it as, the gay uncles who just want to sit them down and teach them where it all came from. So one of the things we definitely want to get across to anyone who's watching this who might not have read the book or bought the book, you don't need to have an interest in Drag Race. Drag Race is set up as a framework to talk about all the other things we want to talk about in this book. And it is basically Queer Culture 101. For anybody who wants to pick it up, you will get the broad strokes and some wonderful stories of the people who have formed what we call queer culture now.
Right. We wanted to take a TV show and from that introduce a bunch of people that you probably didn't know about.
Right.
Or if you knew some about them, you didn't know enough, or we didn't know as much as you can now by reading the book. And because our target was mainly the young fans of the show, or the younger people in the community, these people are very computer savvy. So we wanted to make sure that we put references in the book, or
everything's Googleable.
Yes, that you could just read the book, as we say in the introduction, read the book with one hand, and the other hand, you're just searching. You're going to YouTube, you're going everywhere to get more information about something we just mentioned in the book.
Okay, so I'm going to do a short reading from the book to give you a sense of what we're doing here. And then we're going to launch into a short discussion about some of the broader themes of the book. And then hopefully you guys out there have questions that can be submitted to Phil, and we would love to answer your questions. I'm going to read from the final chapter of the book, chapter 10, which is called The Ministry of Drag. And I chose this passage. There are a lot of passages in the book. We have read many of them over the course of our tour for this book. And some of the stories are very sad or poignant. And some of the stories highlight great triumphs. And this passage we're reading now is because I want to get across that drag queens, they're not frivolous. And if you look at drag queens as avatars of our community, there's so much there that you can uncover. So, brief reading starting now. Drag Race Season 4 alum Kenya Michaels was performing her set at a local gay bar on Latin night, and the club was packed with Latinx LGBTQ folks and their friends, who were all feeling what Miss Michaels was serving in her white bodysuit, cha-cha heels, and Beyonce wig. Finishing her lip-syncing and dancing set, a sweaty and out-of-breath Kenya took her bows to the cheering crowd, blew them kisses, waved goodnight, and headed back to the portion of the club that served as her dressing room. That's when the guy with the semi-automatic rifle opened fire on the crowd that had just applauded her. It was June 12th, 2016. This was the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, and 49 queer and queer-friendly people were killed as one man's rage was once again turned toward the disenfranchised and unleashed on them while at their most vulnerable. Kenya hid during the shooting and later posted on Instagram of her emotional devastation and of the many friends killed that night. My heart is broke. They took everything from me. It's not surprising that a drag queen was at the single worst instance of anti-LGBTQ violence in history. A drag queen threw her shot glass at the bar mirror at Stonewall and screamed for her civil rights. Drag queens twirled and joked and lip-synced their way through the AIDS crisis, raising money and awareness and pulling the community together. Drag queens marched for marriage, screamed for the rights of their queer siblings to serve in the military, and danced their joy for a half a century on enough pride floats to make it to the moon and back if you stacked them end to end. Drag queens and kings have been at the center of queer life and present at every single battle and celebration in the past century of queer history. When they weren't the soldiers on the front line, they were the queer fife and drum corps, keeping time and urging the community to continue pressing on. Jose Soria worked at the legendary San Francisco queer cafe, The Black Cat, in the 1950s as a waiter. And later, because like any queen worth her glitter, Jose couldn't keep his mouth shut while working and soon became known for his singing voice as an opera singing drag queen. Jose was born in San Francisco in 1922, and to hear him tell it, never really had to come out of the closet because he was never really in it. He lived his life openly, even while serving in the Army during World War II, when all hands were needed, and the fact of his open gayness mattered less than the fact that he was willing to serve. After he came back from the war and started gaining a reputation as a local drag queen of some talent and flair, he became known and billed as the Nightingale of Montgomery Street, famous among the queens and queers of the time for his practice of leading everyone out of the bar at closing time, singing a parody of God Save the Queen, reworded as God Save Us Nelly Queens. Bear in mind just how incredibly restrictive and conformist the 1950s were, and how bold it was to round up a bunch of queer folks to literally sing out their queerness into the night. More pointedly, Jose led the song while directing the group to sing it to the men being held at the roundhouse across the street, locked up for cruising. That is some serious, fabulous defiance. In 1960, he jumped feet first into politics, first by forming the League for Civil Education, which he launched to combat the laws that made it illegal for bars and restaurants to serve alcohol to queer people. He was the first openly gay candidate to run for office in the United States, making a run for the San Francisco Board of Governors in 1961 in response to ongoing police harassment of the gay community. He didn't win, but he garnered enough votes, press, and visibility to change San Francisco politics for good, ensuring from that day forward that the gay community was itself a voting bloc and constituency whose voices deserved a hearing and whose needs deserved consideration. It was a huge step, and for most people that would be enough of a legend to hang your name on, but Jose was just getting started. In 1965, after being awarded a crown as Queen of the Beaux-Arts Ball, Jose declared himself Her Royal Majesty, Empress of San Francisco, Jose I, the Widow Norton. That latter part of her title was a reference to the legendary 19th century San Francisco character, Joshua Norton, who similarly declared his de facto royal status in 1859 as the Emperor Norton. From that initial inspiration, Jose went on to form his own court, awarding titles of nobility to its members and dubbing it, naturally enough, the Imperial Court of San Francisco. Not just a form of queer socializing or cosplay, the Imperial Court of San Francisco was civic-minded, raising money for LGBTQ organizations and groups through, what else? Drag shows. As you might imagine, the idea of drag queens and queer folks modeling themselves on the grand royal courts of Europe was too delicious to remain within the confines of San Francisco. Imperial courts started springing up in other cities, and within a decade of the San Francisco court's founding, the International Imperial Court System was established, bringing together chapters in cities all over the world, dedicating to raising funds and awareness of LGBTQ causes and giving queer folks and drag queens a way of bonding together and using their fabulousness to help change the world. Today, with over 65 chapters worldwide, the International Imperial Court System stands as one of the oldest and largest LGBTQ organizations in existence. The absolute Empress Jose Soria, I always get touched by this, died in 2013 at the age of 90, having achieved legendary status through her groundbreaking political and organizing work. She is buried in a plot next to the Emperor Norton. Now, I always get worked up reading this book, and it's not because I love my writing or our writing so much. It's because these stories touch me so deeply. Right. And Jose Soria is an example of someone whose life was just a triumph from beginning to end. He just lived it openly. He lived it beautifully and fantastically. The reason I get so choked up that he was buried next to the Emperor Norton is because one of the things that came out in the research of this book, it's stuff that we knew as queer men who follow queer history, but to see it laid out like this is, wow, queer folks lead the most colorful, beautiful, artistic lives. Not all of us, obviously. Certainly, we're not out here breaking boundaries, the two of us. But over the course of our history, our people have done amazing, beautiful, funny, original things. And I can't think of a queen who was more of that type than Jose Soria, who not only did that, but also went into politics and changed politics.
Right.
And the reason we wanted to read that passage as opposed to some of the other ones was to establish the point that drag queens aren't frivolous, drag queens aren't meaningless, and they're not just about entertainment. There's so many stories of drag queens who used their talent, who used their stage, their platform, or whatever to make real change.
Right, because the real changes came by them using their talent. It was because, and that's the thing we wanted to emphasize and highlight in the book, is that these people were extremely talented one way or another.
And colorful. And beautiful.
Right, and they used that, probably they didn't even know they were using it, but they did, and to make a change somewhere, somehow, in our history.
Now, this story is actually, in some ways, a little atypical from the stories that we have been doing readings about in previous book tour appearances, because there is a theme in the book, a through line in the book about queer art and how it is created and the forces that come into play to create it. So, for instance, you've heard of the term shade or reading. If you've watched Drag Race, you've heard that term many times. You've seen the library challenge and you've seen it play out. Well, shade and reading, which was first introduced to the world in Paris is Burning by the legendary Dorian Corey, is an African-American social and humor tradition. And there are even some scholars who feel that it goes all the way back to African-American slavery. The ability to sort of talk back to someone without them realizing that you're talking back to them. You can see how that might be endemic to African-American existence prior to the mid 20th century. And well, I'm not even gonna get into that. But that is, for instance, that is an example of where an art form, which in this day and age, we consider shade and reading to be a form of verbal art. It is an art form that arose out of people who were being oppressed. It carried over into the drag and the transgender community through Black women, through Black trans women, and Black drag queens. They took shade and they basically introduced it to the queer community, and it expanded outward from there. But it is born out of oppression.
Right, and the term is shade, but it's pretty much their way of defending themselves.
Using your mouth.
Using your mouth and using it in a way that they could get away with it.
Right.
It wasn't necessarily directly at you or accusing you of something.
And if you were a trans woman who was living on the streets as, in a pre-Stonewall era, if you were a trans woman, there weren't many options open to you. And a lot of them either wound up doing drag or wound up doing sex work or wound up doing both. And if you were what was called back then a street queen, then having a sharp tongue and being able to send someone reeling by just lashing out at them with your tongue, that was a survival technique. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So when Ru says reading is fundamental, yes, it is fundamental. And for 75 years, it was fundamental to the existence of Black drag queens and Black trans women. They wouldn't have survived without it. Another example, voguing. The dance form that arose out of the Harlem Ball scene.
You saw with Madonna, yes.
Right. If you've watched Pose, the show, the Ryan Murphy show that is based on the Harlem Ball scene. Voguing, the legend has it, started in Rikers Island in New York among queer, Black, and Latinx prisoners who couldn't fight, or they would get, put
into trouble.
They would get put in solitary or whatever. And they couldn't sort of sass each other in a gay way without sort of outing themselves as gay in a prison population. So voguing actually became a form of battle a form, voguing to this day is a competitive dance form, but it arose out of people who couldn't fight, but needed to establish dominance amongst themselves.
Right. So they created all these movements that you don't touch the other person.
Voguing competitions, you're not supposed to touch each other.
You move, your hands, your legs, your whole body, but you're not necessarily touching the other person. So you get away with it.
Right. Two more examples. The pit crew on Drag Race, okay, which are the hot muscular guys who come out in Speedos. Why is the image of gay male desire for 30 to 50 years, why is it always these ripped muscular men in little tiny Speedos? That's not necessarily what straight women think of when they think of hot men, but it has been the dominant image of gay male desire for 50 plus years. And the pit crew is the end result of that. It's normalizing it for a television audience. But the reason that has become such a dominant image in gay male life, queer male life, and in queer male desire is because male pornography was illegal.
Mm-hmm.
And you could get into serious trouble. You could be not just jailed, but institutionalized. This is going back pre-1968 for owning it. So if there were a few gay men who were entrepreneurs who knew there was an audience of men out there who wanted their version of Playboy in the 1950s, but couldn't get it. So they introduced physique magazines, which were the precursors to bodybuilding magazines.
Right.
And they featured models in skimpy little posing outfits, sometimes in little cowboy hats or little police officers' uniforms or whatever like that.
Whatever fantasy, you could get away with.
And they were billed as, physical culture magazines,
right.
But they were clearly erotic in tone. And this was how that sort of image was put out there. We make the comparison in the book. Why is the dominant image of young female beauty, the dominant media image of young female beauty is a fit girl in a bikini? And that's been going on for 50 years. For the same exact reasons, because pornography laws would not let certain parts of the body be exposed. Those parts on a woman being the parts that are covered by a bikini, those parts on a man being the parts that are covered by a Speedo.
Right.
So that's where that came from. Final one, lip syncing. Why do drag queens lip sync? Why is this such a dominant form in the drag community? Because, again, in the mid-20th century, in the 1950s and the 1960s, there was a booming, for a short period of time, for about a decade, a booming female impersonation entertainment complex that traveled the country. Every major metropolitan area had one or had a theater where one would come in and travel a couple of times a year and put on shows. In the post-war environment, straight people did actually go to these reviews. Where men and trans women would dress up as Marilyn Monroe or Elizabeth Taylor or Betty Davis or Judy Garland and would serve them this sort of hometown version of Hollywood glamour.
No, they had the voice, they had the look, they had everything to go with it. They were really professionals.
But as these reviews became a little bit more popular over the 1950s, the police were hearing more and more about them. And you have to remember that drag up until the mid-1960s was illegal. All over the country, right. It was illegal for a man to appear in public in women's clothing.
Like a woman.
Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So what happened was these reviews in the 1950s started getting more and more popular, and the cops started raiding them. And the local musicians guilds, who weren't necessarily gay, they were just playing shows in these reviews, right. Didn't like that they were constantly being either arrested or raided. So they started charging higher and higher, more and more exorbitant rates to clubs that featured drag reviews. Eventually, a lot of them had to go out of business because they couldn't pay musicians. But some of them, the ones that survived, realized, well, we can't hire musicians, but if we put a record on and get one of these queens to get up and lip sync it. And prior to that point, what were called record queens were considered the lowest form of drag, like trashy drag. You would only see them in trashy bars and that sort of thing. But because people couldn't sing in front of live music, drag queens couldn't sing with live musicians anymore, this became pretty much the dominant form of drag entertainment by around late 1960s to the 1970s. That's when it really elevated. So all of these examples that we're trying to give you are examples of queer art that has gone out into the mainstream. Most of us have heard of these things. We've heard of voguing, we've heard of shade, we've heard of lip syncing, and most of us understand that the little rainbow Speedo guys on the pride floats are a long-standing tradition in queer life. But all of these things arose out of some form of oppression or marginalization.
It was a way to get away with it, to still do what you want to do, but not necessarily being out there exposed to be, to end up in jail, pretty much.
So the story of queer culture in the last 100 years, the story of all of our little art forms, all of the people who made queer culture what it is today, it is largely a story of struggle. Now, I mean, you could take a really broad view and say all art is the story of struggle on some level, but queer art is definitely the story of people overcoming oppression, responding to oppression with creativity, with defiance. The other thing about queer art is that queer cultural traditions and queer art are often about taking something from the mainstream and shooting it through a queer lens and looking at it in a satirical way or in a way that examines our preconceptions. Drag is at the heart of that idea. It is at the heart of taking social and media conventions of what femininity is, what women are, what glamorous women look like, shooting them through a gay lens, twisting them, distorting them, and coming out on the other side, in some cases, making a statement about how we look at women, what we expect of women, the roles that we impose on women. I'm going to lead this to the next point, which actually has come up quite a bit in our writing of the book and in our touring, which is drag misogynist? We've had women ask us this question, or women who have come to us and said, I find it misogynist. And I'm not here to tell anybody what they should and shouldn't think about drag. And if you see misogyny in it, I'm not going to sit there and be like, well, you're just wrong. However, I will note that everything that we know about drag as an art form and as a tradition, and all the things that we know about the people who created all of those traditions in drag, a significant portion of them were not men, they were trans women. So even if some of the traditions in drag feel like exaggerations of womanhood or feel like criticisms of womanhood or criticisms of femininity, understand that a lot of those traditions, a lot of those forms were developed by people who were working through their own issues about their own gender and coming to a conclusion about it. One of the things we found in mid-century drag, the huge commonality of transgender women doing drag. As I said, back then, you didn't have many employment options if you wanted to live as a woman, as a trans woman, and the options were drag and sex work. So I remember when the book first came out, one or two of the first reviews that came out had a bit of a problem that they felt that we were conflating drag queen identities and transgender women. And of course they are different, but the history, there's so much of an overlap. And again, this goes back to why we wanted the book to be so broadly inclusive, why we wanted trans women and trans men and lesbians and non-binary people in the book is, as much as we love Drag Race, as much as we are fans of that show, it is limited in its representation of queer people. Because, and I'll say it, because RuPaul himself is somewhat limited in his view of what drag is. So
it has changed, it has expanded in a certain way. I mean, we've been watching the show since season 1 and a lot of things have changed, but it's still limited. And hopefully they will expand a little more with the success of the show or create different versions of the same show. We'll see how it works. But it's also interesting to see how the community, the fans of the show have also expanded. We have attended Comic-Con, Drag Cons, I'm sorry.
He's always calling it Comic-Con.
I know, I always call it Comic-Con, Drag Con. And we've seen all sorts of people represented and attended the convention because they are fans of the show, especially young women, a lot of, not just people in the community represented by the LGBTQ, but also straight women.
When we first started blogging the show, the audience that was responding to our blogging was all gay men.
Right.
It's all gay men. And if you ever watched the show back then when it was on Logo in 2009, 2010, every ad break everything was geared towards gay men. It was ads for jockstraps and lube and HIV meds. And that was every ad break. It was very obvious that that's the only people watching it in 2009, or the only people World of Wonder, the producers of the show, thought to pitch the show to were gay men. Right. But once the show moved to VH1, it got a much broader audience and a much more broadly queer or queer-friendly audience. Right. And those are the people we wrote the book for. Right. Because I feel like most of the gay, although I have to say, I feel like most gay men would know a lot of the references in this book. But so many gay journalists and gay writers have come back to us and said, I have learned so much from this, not to brag, but has said, I have learned so much from this book.
Because we tried to mix it, have famous people are already famous out there, like Divine and so on, but also
people you never heard of.
Or stories of situations, events in our history that people had no idea about.
So that wraps up our little presentation, and we would love to turn it over to Phil to field any questions that anybody has. Hopefully people have been sending him some questions. We can talk forever, but if you've got questions, we'd love to hear them.
We can also answer them.
You too, that was wonderful, extremely informative. Thank you very much. We do have questions. We've got a bunch of questions for you, all right? So let's dive into it.
Okay.
All right. The first one's actually a two-part question, so I'll just do the first part. This is from Rebecca Call. And first she says, I'd love to get your thoughts on Dragula if you've watched it. Specifically, what references and traditions do you think Dragula draws from that Drag Race does not?
That's a great question, Rebecca. I'm going to start right off and say that we spent so much time researching the traditions in Drag Race that our exposure to Dragula is sort of amateur. I mean, we've watched the show many times, and I actually really loved the show.
And we liked it, yeah.
If there's any traditions it's pulling from, it's all the drag traditions that Drag Race does not pull from. But Drag Race, we should note, is strictly, if you really want to break it down, Drag Race is half of a drag pageant, half drag ball. And that is basically how the show is constructed. And most of the really mainstream parts of Drag Race, the really glitzy parts of Drag Race, come out of the pageant tradition. The Dragula tradition is all about the underground drag tradition. It's not about glamorous drag. It's about freaky drag. It's about horror drag. And there is a long tradition of horror drag in the queer community. That's what Dragula is pulling from. And I love that it exists as an alternative to Drag Race because, like I said, Drag Race is very mainstream. It's very glitzy. And Dragula really centers that idea of drag being a playground for freaks. It doesn't always have to be a place for fabulous people and glamorous people. It can be a respite for the really freaky weirdos.
Right, and we have one of these freaks in our book, which is Hibiscus, we love.
Right.
And it's that type of drag that is not necessarily pretty and beauty, but it's just whatever you feel like dressing up like.
Yeah.
That's one example.
Great. To go forward with her question, she says, secondly, are there any fascinating people who did not make the cut in the book, but whom you'd like to highlight at this time?
Oh my God, so many.
Oh, it's been a while since we did the research, but one of the saddest things that we had to do was cut out international references.
Right.
And if you know anything about international drag, countries like Great Britain have a tremendous drag history. France has this tremendous drag history. And when you get into the German drag queens and the German queer performers of the 1920s during the pansy craze, then you start getting into the fates of all these people because most of them were rounded up for the camps when the Nazis took over. All of those stories had to be put up by the wayside, which really broke our hearts, but we had to keep our focus narrow, or otherwise the book would have been all over the map. If there's one person that really, really broke my heart was we had to basically cut Harvey Fierstein out of the book. He's mentioned and he's given like a paragraph here or there, but Harvey Fierstein is like this incredibly important figure in the history of drag and theater and queer theater. I think the man is a god in so many ways. I just worship him for everything he's done. But when you're writing about, there's a chapter on drag theater in the book that relates to the sketch challenges on Drag Race. And Harvey Fierstein's work, while incredibly important in that arena, didn't have a lot to do with Drag Race. Drag Race didn't pull from Harvey Fierstein's career to do it. They pulled from Divine. If you look at the Drag Race sketch work, it's all John Waters, it's all Divine, it's all based on that. It's not based on legitimate theater in the Harvey Fierstein sense. And as much as I worship that man, it took until the final draft for us to finally cut him out of it. And it killed me to have to do it. So.
All right. We have a question here from JC that I think a lot of people, it might be on a lot of people's minds. How has the Trump culture of today affected the treatment that you've received from the public?
Us personally?
Yeah.
Okay, well, people to this day, Trump people to this day, think that we should be doing coverage of Melania Trump's fashion because we spent 8 years covering Michelle Obama's fashion choices. And it was never a question we weren't going to do that. Number one, we probably weren't going to cover any first lady after Michelle Obama. We covered Michelle Obama for 8 years because she was an historic first lady and because she understood the semiotics of how historic she was, and she used that in her clothing to send messages. And we spent 8 years deciphering those messages and talking about them. No other first lady of the crop that might have come up in the last few years, like Ann Romney or Cindy McCain or any of those women, none of them were going to be that for us. And we always knew that we were not going to cover the next first lady. Then it turned out to be Melania Trump, and we were like, well, we're definitely not covering her because, sorry folks, but I'm not sorry at all. She represents everything we are fighting against, basically everything that offends us the most.
We absolutely love fashion, and one portion of our site is dedicated to fashion. And we felt that Michelle Obama really introduced a lot of new designers, people that we never heard of before, like Jason Yu. People in the fashion industry knew who they were, but she's the one who wore his dress and everyone started talking about him. So she created that conversation about fashion that we didn't have before. Everybody knows Calvin Klein, Michael Kors, and so on, all these big brands, but very few people knew all these designers that she started wearing and representing. So to us, fashion people having a fashion site, that was fascinating. That's why we cover her. And then, we stopped there.
So to answer the question, yes, when we announced that we were not doing Melania Trump, we got, you're going to be the first ones thrown in the ovens.
So
we got that kind of stuff.
We still do get that.
Yes, anyway. But I mean, any queer writer out there is going to get that sort of thing. And I've said it every time it has come up. It can be a total pain. It can be really unpleasant. It can really get you down. But I know for a fact that I don't get nearly what the average Black female writer gets online from her readers, or just the average female writer. We don't get the crap thrown at us that women online get thrown at them. So we have to take it with temper it. It sucks, especially to be, subjected to homophobic abuse or whatever, but whatever, it's part of the job.
All right. We've got a question here from Emma Marie. Has the popularity of Drag Race changed drag ball culture? And then she goes on to say, can't wait to read the book, waiting for my copy in the mail.
Oh, fantastic. I don't think Drag Race has had any effect on drag ball culture at all.
Quite the opposite.
Quite the opposite. I urge everyone who is interested in, if you've watched Pose, if you've seen Paris is Burning, and that's your understanding of drag ball culture, that's great, but that's history. That's the base understanding. If you really want to understand the drag ball culture of today, there's a wonderful 2017 film called Kiki, K-I-K-I, which is available for rent on streaming. And you can go on YouTube, there's a channel called Ballroom Throwbacks Television, which is clip after clip after clip of the modern ball scene. And it is not like Paris is Burning anymore.
Right.
It clearly has its roots in that culture. And I think it's a beautiful thing to watch. Kiki was a revelation to me the first time I watched it, because this white guy's understanding of ball culture was locked into 1989 from Paris is Burning. So to see the 21st century version of it, to see young people in 21st century, culture, bringing that art form forward.
Right, and then what's fascinating about the new scene is that they not only do the balls, but they're so committed to
community service,
community service,
activism.
to help the community in any way possible.
So it's completely separate from Drag
Right.
Race. It has nothing to do with it. And in many ways, the ball community has little to do with drag as we know it anymore. They are definitely, the balls are still about presentation. It is still an overtly queer form of art. It is still predominantly Black and Latinx people creating this form of art, but it's not drag queens walking out in dresses necessarily the way you see it on Paris is Burning.
That's one thing that we always emphasize when we talk to people about the book and about the Drag Race the show, is that Drag Race the show is just one version or a few versions of what drag, the drag scene and the drag community is out there.
Absolutely.
Right? There are so many different representations that we don't see on the show that it's out there. If you go to a gay bar, if you go to any performance out there, and you can find them easily, you'll see that there's a lot more to the drag scene than we see on the show.
Yeah.
This one comes from Megan W. She says, "It's so great to see you highlighting these amazing people." Well, that's nice. "Often the stories from the people in your book were outside of mainstream history. Did you find it difficult to do research on them?"
Yes and no. You go ahead and you did more of the research.
I don't want to dominate. I know that I wind up doing way more talking.
It's just the way it is.
It's just the way it is. But well, yes, there were a few people that we didn't know much about.
And it was hard to find anything about them.
But the book was devised to be readily available to any young person that picked it up, or any curious person that picked it up, to easily go to Google and find people immediately. So as the book evolved, we realized we didn't want people to be too obscure. We wanted stuff that was out there on the internet for people to find. So basically every performer that we have highlighted in the book, you can find a video of them online, or you can find a track of their music if they're a pre-video artist.
And we did pick, people for the cover and the back, but there are a ton more people inside the book that we're not necessarily illustrated on the cover.
But yes, there were several. I mean, there's Alicia Brevard, whose story we came across early on in our research. She was a female impersonator in the early 1960s in a legendary San Francisco drag bar called Finocchio's. And she's just a footnote in queer history. But we found her story so poignant and so interesting because she left the farm and her life as a boy and moved to San Francisco as she understood herself to be a woman, but she needed to figure out how to do that. And like many women of that period, she wound up doing drag. And she didn't know a thing about it. She had to be taught by all the drag queens how to do it. And she wound up becoming a very celebrated Marilyn Monroe impersonator because she was this very curvy, she sort of had a slight facial resemblance to Marilyn. Beautiful, beautiful woman. And so she left drag after several years because it was really only her entree into her life as a woman. She self-castrated in order to get a doctor to force a doctor to allow her to transition. And this was not an uncommon story back then for trans women. They would do that. And when that story came up, I was like, I want this story in the book because it's an example of that kind of desperation that these women had to live their lives. Long story short, she went on to become a Playboy bunny. She went on to become a day player and actress in 1960s television. She had kind of a long career. She never became famous, but she had a lot of work. She got her master's degree in theater, wound up becoming a professor. She married 3 times. And according to her, only 2 of her husbands actually did not know she was trans at the time they were married. She lived her life as a woman, but she learned how to be a woman through drag. And it's just this very fascinating story of someone who, she wasn't famous like a lot of the other people in the book, but her story represented so many other stories. Right. So Alicia Brevard, look her up.
Alicia Brevard. Okay. You guys, you two are well loved because everybody here is prefacing their questions. Rachel Caesar says, "So glad you could turn this into a virtual appearance. I was wondering if you could discuss the evolution of the audience and participants of Drag Race, as well as it has gone more mainstream." For example, recently it has exploded in popularity with young people, and this month there have been cisgender women on Celebrity Drag Race. How do you think the show will evolve in the future? That's a lot. If you want me to reread,
That's a lot. And I feel like we
We'll
might have touched on
summarize it.
some of this already, but as we noted earlier, the show started off as a show that was clearly pitched towards gay men as an audience. And I don't think it really expected to become as big as it did. But it switched over to VH1 and the audience exploded. That was when suddenly Drag Race was on magazine covers and started getting nominated for Emmys and then eventually started winning Emmys. That is when the show transitioned from a gay male audience to a general audience. And I think a lot of non-queer people, straight people, cis people watch the show and are huge fans of the show.
I think
but I'm sorry, there is that core group of sort of broadly queer or queer allied young people that watch the show that are slowly learning about drag through the show. But you're right, it is a very mainstream form of drag. And that's why the book is being used as sort of the gateway drug, like using Drag Race as the gateway drug to queer culture. If you start with this, you can learn all this other stuff. As for the future of the show, we've talked about this. I think eventually some version of Drag Race is going to have drag kings in it, is going to have transgender women. Drag Race has had trans women contestants, some of whom didn't come out until after they were on the show, but none of them have reached the heights.
Right.
So I would, eventually I think there might be a trans winner. There might be some version of the show that allows drag kings in or cis women in. Right. I can see Michel Visage has been pushing for that.
Right.
And because Ru is so stubborn about his idea of what drag should be, I suspect there will be some version of Michel Visage's Drag Race that will get some version, some spin-off. I mean, Michel Visage is a female drag queen. She's perfect for that.
What I find fascinating is that the viewers, they have changed so much. They have expanded and changed so much faster than the show, and the show needs to catch up now. That's pretty much it.
But like I said, Ru is stubborn.
Ru is stubborn, but he has to understand that for the show to continue and to satisfy all the viewers, they need to make drastic changes.
And I will say that World of Wonder, the show's production team, God bless those queens. They know how to make a buck. They know how to expand that thing and make money off of it. There's Drag Race Live in Las Vegas. There's the Work the World tour. There's all the various YouTube shows that are produced by World of Wonder. So the idea that they won't have a drag king show eventually just doesn't seem likely to me.
We'll see.
Or a bio queen show, which is what you call when cisgender women do drag. It's coming because the fandom keeps asking for it and because the culture is shifting in that direction. Right. But I don't think it'll have RuPaul's face on it. It'll be some other Drag Race spinoff. That's my prediction.
So if the two of you were to create a Drag Race show, what changes would you make?
Exactly that.
Exactly that.
Yeah. I would love to see, I mean, we used to really struggle with the idea of, well, if you include drag kings and if you include cis women and if you include trans women, can you really judge them all using the same criteria? But the judging portion of Drag Race has gotten so broad in what they judge the queens on. Like back in the day, the queens were yelled at way more if you could see their 5 o'clock shadow or if their body wasn't cinched to look feminine or if they wore pants, they were criticized for that sort of thing. Now the criticisms are all, you're showing us your true self. You're being very brave. It's all very like American Idol, The Voice kind of, broadly. So yeah, if we were doing this show, we would bring the drag kings in, we'd bring the cis women in, and we would figure out challenges or judging criteria that allowed everyone. Look at what's Crystal Method and how different if you're not sure, I'm referring to the current season of Drag Race.
Right.
Crystal Method's drag is nothing like the other drag that's on that show.
It wouldn't exist in season 1. Let's put it this way.
Right, because it's not necessarily female gender performing drag. It's very clowny drag. It's kind of freaky drag. Why couldn't a cis woman do that? Why does that? Why couldn't a trans woman or a drag king do that sort of drag? So that would be that's what we would do.
All right. In your opinions, what would you say are some important examples of drag influence and historical importance in film, music, and on stage? And furthermore, do you have any recommendations for our viewers out there to check out if they wanted to dive a little deeper into that world?
Well, there's a whole section at the back of the book that tells people what movies they should go look at. But in mainstream culture, when you talk about drag history, I think The Adventures of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert is a huge one. Mm-hmm. I think because it was very mainstream, and we watched it several times during the research for this book. And what really struck us about the movie is that it's, I think, 92, which would make it 28 years old. The drag looks very fresh. It doesn't look dated at all. It looks like all of those looks could walk a drag race runway today.
There's also Tu Wong Fu.
There's Tu Wong Fu, but I wouldn't call that as influential because it was sort of latching onto
but
the
it's a product of what was going on, and RuPaul is in it, and
absolutely
a bunch of other queens.
Slightly more updated, Hedwig and the Angry Inch.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Is another one. Kinky Boots. If you want to go further back, Torch Song Trilogy, which is the Harvey Fierstein movie, in which he plays a drag queen that falls in love. Those are all fantastic, like mainstream versions of drag that, when you talk, and this is mentioned in the book, mainstream drag is often a straight man in a dress. It's often Dustin Hoffman in Tootsie, or Robin Williams in Mrs. Doubtfire, or Tyler Perry as Medea. So when we talk about mainstream queer drag, those things, those examples that we just gave you, those are examples that took queer drag and put it out into the mainstream. It wasn't just a man in a dress, it was a queer man in a dress doing queer art. In terms of theater, it would largely be a lot of the same answers. Kinky Boots, Hedwig and the Angry Inch, La Cage aux Folles.
Yes, movie and theater.
Yes, but I have a problem with the Birdcage, the Robin Williams, Nathan Lane. It doesn't, I mean, other people's mileage may vary, but I don't feel like that is a representation of, even though queer men were involved in the writing of that story and the writing of the songs in La Cage aux Folles, it feels very mainstream. It feels like a straight people's idea of what queer people are like, what drag queens are like. I'm not offended by it, but I don't think it really represents our life, our culture, the way, say, Priscilla or Kinky Boots or Hedwig does.
It's a little more maybe pop, a little more bubblegummy, light.
A little bit, yeah.
Right, exactly.
Sure. All right, the last question here. This is an anonymous one from the audience. They're saying, once again, so you both are saying that there's room for a sequel, right? Legendary Children International?
Oh, yeah. Yes, we keep telling people, look, you buy enough of this book and we will pitch Legendary Children of the World in a second. We could write that proposal in 3 days.
We already have half of the book.
So yeah, people go out and buy that book. Legendary Children. I would love to write about the ladyboy tradition in Thailand, or the drag queens of Latin America. My God, the Brazilian drag queens, sickening. And we had to cut all that out of the book. So yes, absolutely. I would love French drag queens, British drag queens, German drag queens. Yeah. So buy this book and there will be a sequel.
Let's buy the book. Tom and Lorenzo, this has been enlightening. It's been awesome. I can't thank you enough for being here with us tonight. It was an honor to have hosted you.
Thank you. It was an honor to be here. Thank you so much.
And thank you everyone for tuning in. Appreciate
Love you all.
Yeah, I echo that. I'd like to thank all of you for joining this spectacular presentation. And I know for certain that you'd love to own your very own copy of the book, Legendary Children. We encourage you to support our partner, independent bookstore, Politics and Prose, where you can easily order your copies online right now. And I say copies because you want multiple of them. You can do this by clicking on the link in the description box that we have below. Also, please plan to join us again next weekend for TGIF Live with Lou Byard, author of the acclaimed novel Courting Mr. Lincoln. That will be at 5:30 p.m. You can also tune in again for our Saturday night premiere featuring Jonathan Karl, Chief White House correspondent for ABC News, as he discusses his new book, Front Row at the Trump Show. And he is going to be interviewed by author and reporter Susan Page. And for the little guys out there, the little book lovers, you can join us on Sunday morning at 11 a.m. to hang out with best-selling author Adam Gidwitz, creator of the Unicorn Rescue Society series and the Grimm trilogy. Until then, feel free to take a look around our festival website at Gaithersburg Book Festival.org. You'll discover all the other amazing programs that VGBF has to offer throughout this month-long virtual festival. All programs will be accessible right here on the VGBF YouTube channel, so make sure that you hit the subscribe bell for notifications. I've been your VGBF host, Phil Kaminsky. Have a great evening, and as always, please keep reading.